right, we're going to do part 2 of the lecture on American political culture, the introductory chapter of your text. And there's going to be some information in this lecture that's not found in the text. So you're going to want to pay particular attention to that part of the lecture. All right, so the things we want to accomplish today is define what we mean by political culture and what does that mean in the context of the United States versus Texas. We're going to talk about the different components of political culture like liberty, equality, and democracy, and define those terms, and then talk about the ethnic diversity that makes up America today. All right, so what is political culture? We can think of political culture as those characteristics or deep-seated beliefs of a particular people. So for the political culture of the United States, these are the characteristics and deep-seated beliefs of those people who are U.S. citizens. For us in Texas, it's what is it that makes a unique Texas political culture. And so when we think about political culture more in depth, we think about these different values and these different beliefs. So if we think of what a value is, this is the shared ideas that a society has about what is good and valuable. And so, unfortunately, there's often a gap between what the value or ideal is and what happens in reality. So, for example, if we think about freedom of speech, when we're hearing someone speak in a public forum, not everyone will be in favor of what that person is saying. And so, what if that speech causes a riot? Then where does that type of value of freedom of speech conflict with what's being done in practice? Or if we believe in freedom of speech, there are particular cases, however, when we want certain, I would guess, types of groups not to have that freedom. So it's not like we want the KKK marching down the streets of Huntsville, even though there's freedom of speech. So there are times when what we value in theory may not be what happens in society in reality. And of course, there's been a long history of the values of liberty and freedom, where we've had a history of slavery and Jim Crow laws and other types of discriminatory policies in the United States. And then if we think about beliefs, these are the things that we believe in as a society. What do we think is true? What do we think is important? So these are the types of things that make up a political culture. Well, many times one's political culture is based on some shared ethnicity or religion or common heritage. In the United States, we're the melting pot, and so we don't have that ethnicity or religion or other type of traditional historical value. What we have are some concepts, and these are America's core values: the concept of liberty, equality, and democracy. So we'll define those more in depth as we go through today. As I mentioned last time, when we think about what we are in terms of a democracy specifically, we are not a pure democracy. Remember, I told you in the last lecture that there's a difference between a democracy where each individual, each citizen participates directly in the governance of the society versus a republic where we elect people to represent and administer the government on our behalf. And one thing that happens in this type of a republic or a democracy that we have is that we have majority rule, as opposed to each one of us being able to voice our opinions into every single issue. We elect people to represent our interests, and so therefore the majority rules, and then we have the issue of individual freedom. And this creates a paradox of democracy, where there's a conflict between majority rule and individual freedom. So you can see in our core beliefs that even though we have the idea of democracy, which is majority rule, we also have a core value of liberty, which is the idea of individual freedom. And sometimes these two things conflict with one another. So what we as citizens and what the government should be doing, that we would hope, is that the majority is ruling, but also prepares a society and creates a society where the minority, in terms of the political process, their rights are protected as well. We've talked about this in theory a lot as a country, but of course there are times when this particular paradox isn't solved. But that's one of the concerns, is how do you solve the conflict between the majority that rules in terms of a political party and then individual freedom. And we're going to see this a lot when we talk about civil liberties and civil rights. All right. We can talk about political culture in another way before we get much further into the American political culture and talk about some subcultures. And when we think about subcultures, one political scientist, Daniel Elazar, did a study about how different subcultures have influenced the American political culture. And he identified 3 different subcultures in a book called American Federalism, A View from the States. And he argues that these political subcultures have been of primary importance in the historical development of the United States, particularly as settlers moved from the East Coast toward the Pacific. And each one of these is rooted, each one of these political cultures, that is rooted in a particular social and geographic setting early in the history of our country and has spread westward in a distinct pattern. So today he argues that each state is dominated by one or a particular combination of these subcultures. So if we look in the original 13 colonies in the upper northeast where Maine, Vermont, and New Hampshire are, this is the beginnings of what he calls the moral political culture. And here politics is seen as a concern for all citizens, where public participation in politics is strongly encouraged, a very Jeffersonian style of politics. Government service is seen as public service, and the expectation of public office holders are that they're not going to derive some sort of personal benefit from their service. So these aren't career politicians for the sake of becoming a powerful individual and being a career politician. People go into public service for the greater good. And it has its roots in Puritan New England towns. Scandinavian immigrants then pushed west into the Great Lakes regions of the Midwest, onto Minnesota and Iowa. You can see that in the red color that's dominant in those states. And then across to the Pacific. And then you can see that their green states are where they are a mixture of the moral political culture and then the individual political culture. So the individualistic political culture is where citizens desire a government with limited functions and limited goals. And you can see that this is where in the original 13 colonies were Pennsylvania, New York, and as they moved westward toward the Midwest part of the country. They wanted to adopt a laissez-faire, if you will, concept of government, where politics and the entry into politics is a means by which people improve themselves, either economically or socially. So politics is seen as a career opportunity and not simply for the service of the public good as it was in the moral political culture. In this particular political culture that we find in the middle part of the country, mass political participation is encouraged through voting. And its roots were Germanic and non-Puritan English settlers of the mid-Atlantic states. And so the pursuit of individual opportunity was placed ahead of communal goals, and that's why it's called the individual political culture. And then you have the traditional political culture that was the political culture of the Deep South, of the original 13 colonies, as well as of the Confederacy. And you can see that Texas is going to be a mixed political culture that is traditional but mixed with the individual political culture. So for traditionalists, government was just one element of the elite social structure that was the pre-commercial social South in the antebellum or pre-war Civil War period. And the function of government was to preserve that social order that was based on the plantation system. So politics were dominated by the social elite and participant by non-elites, i.e. slaves, freed slaves, if there were any in the region, and then poor white Southerners was discouraged through poll taxing and literacy laws even after the Civil War and into the 20th century. Party politics was less important in this subculture than what the role of the party was in the moral or individual political culture, and its roots of course, is in the plantation-based agricultural system in Virginia and South Carolina, the Old South, and then it moved westward into the Southwest. So Texas has a traditional and individualistic culture, and Elazar argues that the mixture of these two, with the traditional element predominating, particularly in the eastern part of the state, but as you move toward the western part of the state and have much more of a frontier atmosphere, the individual political culture becomes more dominant. And if we think more in depth about what are the subcultures specifically in Texas and the subgroups in Texas, we have, obviously Southern Anglo-Americans who come from that tradition of the political culture of the Deep South, where originally government should preserve the social status quo. And the Upper South and part of the western part of the state of Texas, where you didn't have as many plantation systems, you had much more of an individualistic type of political culture. Of course, as you move to the frontier, you have an increasing influence of the individualistic political culture over time. And you can see, compared to the rest of the country, where whites make up almost 68% of the population, in the state of Texas they make up less than 50%. Mexican Americans in the state of Texas make up about 35% of the population in the state of Texas, and this is much larger than the relative population in the country as a whole. And so Mexican Americans were part of that original political culture of Texas, perhaps the original culture of Texas, and were part of that traditional system of landed elites. Okay. So this elements of traditionalism still exist in parts of the Mexican American or Hispanic community. They have a strong adherence to the role of the family and the extended family and the role of the Catholic Church. And then we have, of course, African Americans in the state of Texas, which is pretty much on par with the relative percentage in the states as a whole. And members of the African American community and particularly their ancestors were forced into the traditionalistic pattern through slavery and were prevented from political participation even after slavery due to Jim Crow laws that were prevalent in the South. So because of continuing discrimination after the Civil War, continuing into the 20th century, for both Mexican Americans and blacks, the exposure to that individualistic values was limited, according to Elazar, because the avenues of opportunity were closed to them. And so we would hope that that has changed over time, where the American political culture of liberty and equality and democracy applies to all. But we know that there is a history of discrimination in this country and in the state of Texas as well. There's a fourth group in the state of Texas that we have a small population enclave of, and that's the German population that you'll find in the hill country around New Braunfels, Greene, and places like Fredericksburg. And they are part of that individualistic political culture. These were not slave owners during the antebellum period. They were probably too poor and suffered discrimination during the World War I and World War II time period. They tended to support the Republican Party traditionally, but that is fading as well, and so these distinctiveness amongst the German population in the state of Texas has faded. All right, well, before we move on, you can see how the population in the state is going to grow over the next 20 or 30 years, where most of everyone is pretty much at a flat rate of growth, whereas the Hispanic population is expected to increase pretty dramatically there. And this, of course, is going to have an impact on the policies that the state deals with, as well as what the nation deals with. All right, so again, as I mentioned earlier, Americans don't share a common bloodline or religion or ethnic heritage, so what unites them are these three main core ideas of liberty, equality, and democracy. So when we think about when we think about liberty, what we're really talking about here, and what's really of major concern, is the idea that people are free to act and think as they choose, as long as they don't infringe upon the freedoms of others. And we think about this liberty and freedom in our personal lives in terms of what we're allowed to say, what we're allowed to believe in, the religion we're allowed to practice. And we also think about this in our economic freedom, where we're free to choose whatever career path or whatever economic endeavors we choose as well. So this is what we think about in terms of liberty. In the colonial period, liberty generally meant freedom from government intervention, and that's still what we believe in today. When it comes to equality, if we had to define equality for the early American settlers, equality meant the absence of a social class that dominated European society. And if we think about why most or a lot of individuals came to the new country, it was to escape that very rigid class structure that is common in European society. at the time with nobility and royalty. So they were talking more about that type of equality in terms of social status. So when we talk about equality, we're not talking about the potential for the equality of outcome. There's no guarantee that everyone's going to have the same stuff. What this really refers to more is the equality of opportunity, that each of us has an equal opportunity to pursue whatever dreams and endeavors we want. We also think of equality in political terms, and equality in terms of voting, in terms of participation in the political process. And here again is where we have that gap that I mentioned earlier between what we think of as a value and belief in theory and how that particular value is carried out in practice. So there is a gap between political equality and the equality that people feel that they experience. And this is what the 99% movement is about. All right, democracy. We've defined this before, but this is the idea that we choose the rulers that we want by voting, and that we have some say over what these rulers do, and if they don't, and we hold them accountable. So if they don't perform or provide policies and outputs and the what of the who gets when, what, how, then we can vote them out of office. So ultimately, it's described as having a citizenry that is one of popular sovereignty. And again, popular sovereignty just means the people have the right to rule. But one of the major concerns, and this is going to be a theme throughout the semester, is that the people are sovereign and majority, and here we're talking about political majority rules, but individual rights of those who lose elections are supposed to still be protected. And democracy in practice. Again, America's history has been one of increasing suffrage for more and more groups. I know that sounds painful, but suffrage here doesn't mean something that is suffering. Suffrage is the right to vote. So over time, we've gone from a country where white male landowners were allowed to participate in terms of the political process to theoretically after the Civil War African Americans to 1919 when women, and over the course of time more and more individuals in our society were given the right to vote. But this doesn't mean that once that right was given that these large groups just flooded the polls. We know that even though right after the Civil War amendments gave African Americans the right to vote in this country, they were prevented from voting from other types of state laws that prevented them, such as literacy laws and poll taxes. So again, that's this difference between what democracy means in theory and how democracy was practiced. We have, even as a democracy, low participation in terms of voter turnout today compared to our European counterparts that are democracies. And we'll talk a lot about why that's the case when we talk about voting. But participation in presidential elections runs about 60 to 70%, which is considered low when you have European countries voting at 90%. Well, who are these different groups that over time have made up the voting public? And so we want to talk a little bit about the different ethnic groups that make up America and contribute to America's unique political culture. We, of course, are an immigrant nation, which means that the government has to constantly think about who are they going to let into this country, and that decision becomes highly political. If you've done any genealogical research on your family, you will find out where they came from and when they came to the United States. Unless you have some Native American bloodlines in your family came from somewhere. I've done some genealogical research, and my family can be traced, at least on one side of the family, up to before the Revolutionary War in Virginia and the South Carolina area. But we can find the relative who made the voyage over from England. So I have a heritage of English and Irish on one side of the family, but I also can trace some family to some Native Americans. But let's say that you're an Italian immigrant who came over at the end of the 1900s, the end of the 1800s, early 1900s, and you wanted your family to come over. There was a wave of Italian immigrants to America. But at some point in time, if the government felt that there was too many Italians coming to the United States, they could limit the number of individuals from that country. And so this becomes highly political. How do you decide who gets in and who does not get to get in? So again, think about how your family came to America and their particular unique journey. we tend to think of a very romantic idea about immigration into the United States, where everyone kind of funneled through Ellis Island and were given their new American papers to live on the East Coast. But now, of course, immigration is an issue that's still a hotly debated topic, where you have immigration coming from Latin America and Asia, where our borders are constantly being watched for illegal immigration. And so this is an issue that is going to continue to be an important one for the country and an important one for the state of Texas, because we're a border state. In order to figure out who all is in the United States, we conduct a census, and the first census did not even count the original Native Americans until until several census later were Native Americans being considered part of the U.S. population. And until World War II, Americans tended, and policymakers in particular, saw very biological distinctions between people and ethnicities, and this led to what is considered a racist immigration policy, to only admit what would consider to be desirable races, and those desirable races were generally from Northern Europe. So until 1870, non-whites could not be naturalized as a U.S. citizen. We had a Chinese Exclusion Act in the 1800s from 1882 to 1943 that limited the number of Chinese immigrants that would be allowed to come into the United States, because these were seen as undesirable races at the time. When we think about 21st century Americans, most of these limitations on immigration policies were lifted in the 1920s, and we had a very different wave of immigration from Asia and Latin America. So the 2008 population breakdown is provided there for you, so you can see where the major groups in America fall. Your book has a lot of cool graphics that shows you this demographic breakdown and how it changed over time. So in 1790, the white population was 81% compared to 19% black. And then by 1900, we have 88% and 12% black, with only 0.5 of other. But now in 2010, 110 years later, the white population has dropped to 63%. Blacks has stayed pretty consistent, about 13%, but you've had a very big increase in the Hispanic population in the United States, as well as Asian, and here are Native Americans making up just about 1% of the U.S. population. But of course, you could see if we go back, that the 1790 census didn't accurately reflect the population because it only counted blacks and whites. It didn't include Native Americans, and the 1900 census didn't count Hispanics. All right, geography, you can see the trend as the population moved westward, and as this westward migration occurred, this changed the policies of what was happening on the frontier, what were some of the issues dealing on the West Coast and in the Rocky Mountain regions that was going to be different than what was being done in the South and in the Northeast. And as population moved away from Northeast, their particular influence over U.S. politics began to decline. And we can see where these different immigrants are coming from in terms of continent of origin. And you can see in the early 1900s, you have mainly from Europe, but over the course of the last century, European immigration has declined over time, whereas from the Americas, that is Latin America and Asia, has increased. Of course, we have a different age distribution that can affect policies. And so different age groups have different interests and have different concerns and want different types of policies from government. So, for example, if we think about what is AARP, this is the Association for the Advancement of Retired People. And so once you reach the age of 50, you're automatically entitled to become a member of the AARP. You pay a small due and you get all kinds of benefits, discounts at lots of places. But one of these things that the AARP is the largest interest group in the United States. So they have a lot of political power, and their needs and what they want to do for their members are going to be very different than what college-age students, for example, are going to want from government. So members of the AARP are the aging generation. These are the baby boomers. They're going to have health care issues and retirement issues. that individuals in their 20s and 30s may not be as concerned about. And so they're more likely to vote in a very different way than the younger generations. So these different age groups are going to vote differently and expect different things from government. When we think about what group has the lowest rate of voter turnout, that is the group that most of you belong to. The ages 18 to 24 have the lowest voter turnout in terms of a demographic group in the United States. And this is mainly due to the fact that most people of that age group express attitudes about apathy. They have voter apathy, where they don't believe the political process speaks to them. So here we can see the age breakdown. In 1900, only 4% of the U.S. population were over the age of 65, and now that's 13% of the population. So this aging population is causing a difference in terms of policies that the average American is concerned about. All right, that's where we're going to close for the lecture on American political culture. So make sure you review the objectives in both lectures. You can replay these at any time and up until after the first exam. You can review the study questions and key terms posted, and then the text provides a practice quiz, and you'll also find some practice information and other good resources on the W.W. Norton website on that link that I've provided there. All right, we will start talking about the Constitution and the founding of our country politically during the next week.